Sometimes the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from being forgotten by everyone who once mattered. When you've lost everything that gave your life meaning, what would you risk to feel human again? Elswyth had nothing left. No home, no family, no place in a world that feared her healing touch. Cast out from her village and living in ruins, she discovered silver chains holding a prisoner beneath an old chapel. The village called him a monster, but when she freed the ancient vampire, he didn't attack. He wept. He remembered her grandmother's face, her voice, her kindness from decades past. How could an immortal creature know a mortal woman who died long ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like grief itself, wrapping around the skeletal remains of what had once been Millhaven's pride, the chapel of St. Bridget. Elswyth pulled her threadbare cloak tighter as she picked her way through the rubble, her bare feet finding purchase on stones that had witnessed centuries of prayer and now bore witness only to decay. The leather pouch at her side, worn smooth by generations of healing hands, knocked gently against her hip with each careful step. 3 seasons had passed since the villagers had driven her out. 3 seasons since they'd called her a witch and blamed her for the plague that had already claimed half their number before she'd even tried to help. The irony wasn't lost on her. They'd banished the only person who might have actually saved them. But that was the way of fear. It devoured reason like fire consumed dry wood. Elswyth remembered the day it had all changed. She could still see Thomas lying in their small cottage, his breathing shallow and laboured, the telltale black spots blooming across his neck like some terrible flower. She'd tried everything, every herb her grandmother had taught her, every prayer her mother had whispered over sick children. Nothing had worked. The plague had taken him anyway, just as it had taken the baker's wife, the blacksmith's son, and dozens of others. You should have saved him, Margaret Thorne had spat at the funeral. What good is your healing if you can't even save your own husband? The accusation had cut deeper than any blade. Not because it held truth, but because Elswyth had asked herself the same question every night since Thomas had drawn his last breath. Her grandmother Mirren had been legendary in these parts, a woman who could draw poison from wounds with her bare hands, who could brew remedies that seemed to work miracles. Elswyth had inherited the knowledge, the recipes, even the special tools carved from bone and blessed wood. But she'd never inherited the power that had made her grandmother's touch truly magical. Or so she'd believed. The villagers' fear had started as whispers. Why hadn't the healer's wife gotten sick? How was it that Elswyth could walk among the dying and emerge unscathed? When she'd successfully treated young Peter's festering wound, the one the travelling physician had pronounced hopeless, the whispers had grown louder. When she'd somehow known that the widow Clark was carrying a child before the woman knew it herself, the whispers had become accusations. She consorts with dark forces, Father Benedict had declared from his pulpit, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. No mortal woman should possess such knowledge of life and death. The final blow had come when she'd tried to help during the worst outbreak. Little Sarah, the merchant's daughter, had been dying. Elswyth had placed her hands on the child's burning forehead and felt something stir within her, a warmth that seemed to flow from her very soul into the girl's fragile body. Sarah had recovered completely by morning, sitting up in bed and asking for breakfast as if she'd never been ill at all. That's when they'd come for her. 50 villagers, led by Father Benedict and armed with torches and righteous fury. They dragged her from her home, stripped her of everything except the clothes on her back and her grandmother's healing pouch. They'd wanted to burn that too, but old Henrik, who remembered Mirren's kindness during his own children's illnesses, had intervened. Let her keep the herbs, he'd said. She'll need them where she's going. Where she was going was nowhere. Banished beyond the village boundaries, forbidden from seeking shelter in any Christian settlement, marked as a practitioner of forbidden arts. She'd wandered for days before finding these ruins, the remains of a chapel older than anyone remembered, built on foundations that predated the village itself. The irony of seeking sanctuary in a house of God wasn't lost on her, especially one so obviously abandoned by divine grace. The roof had collapsed decades ago, leaving only weathered stone walls and the suggestion of what had once been beautiful arches. Wild vines had claimed the altar, and what remained of the windows let in more wind than light. But it was here, in this forgotten place, that Elswyth had learned to survive. She'd made a shelter of fallen stones and scavenged timber, tucked into what had once been a side chapel. The space was small but defensible, and the thick walls provided protection from the worst of the mountain weather. A natural spring bubbled up through cracks in the ancient floor, a blessing that suggested this place had been built on sacred ground long before Christians had claimed it. The villagers avoided these ruins, crossing themselves when they had to pass nearby. They whispered that it was cursed, that unholy things walked here in the darkness. Elswyth had found those rumors useful. Fear kept them away, and their absence gave her the solitude she needed to grieve, to heal, and to discover uncomfortable truths about herself. Living alone had taught her things about her abilities that she'd never learned while surrounded by others. When she was truly desperate, cold, hungry, or injured from her harsh new existence, the power that had saved little Sarah would sometimes surface again. Never when she tried to summon it, only when genuine need stripped away her conscious control. She could encourage plants to grow in impossible conditions. She could sense illness in animals before any symptoms appeared. She could find water sources by feeling the pull of underground streams. These weren't skills her grandmother had taught her, yet they felt as natural as breathing when they emerged. It terrified her. The healing pouch contained more than herbs now. In her wanderings through the ruins, Elswyth had found things that shouldn't have existed in a Christian chapel. Small carved stones that hummed with their own warmth, crystals that seemed to glow softly in complete darkness, fragments of what might once have been ritual tools, their purposes lost to time, but their significance undeniable. Each discovery had forced her to confront the possibility that her grandmother's power hadn't been divine gift or clever herbalism. It had been something far older and more dangerous, something that apparently ran in their blood. The villagers had been right to fear her, though not for the reasons they'd claimed. Elswyth picked her way through the nave, noting how the morning light fell differently today. The storm that had raged for 3 days had shifted some of the larger stones, revealing sections of the floor she'd never seen before. Strange markings were etched into the flagstones, symbols that made her head ache when she looked at them directly, but seemed to sing when glimpsed from the corner of her eye. She knelt beside one particularly clear carving, her fingers tracing the intricate spirals and interlocking circles. The stone was warm to the touch, warmer than it had any right to be in the chill morning air. As her fingertips followed the carved lines, she felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the same warmth that had saved little Sarah, that had helped her survive these months of exile. The power was growing stronger. She could feel it building inside her, like water behind a dam, pressing against barriers she didn't know how to control. Sometimes she woke from dreams of flying, of healing with just a touch, of commanding elements with her voice. Sometimes she woke with her hands glowing with soft light that faded as soon as she became fully conscious. It should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, she felt a strange anticipation, as if her body was preparing for something her mind couldn't yet comprehend. The storm had revealed more than ancient carvings. At the far end of the chapel, where the altar had once stood, a section of the floor had collapsed entirely, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the spitty, morning light. Steps carved from the same ancient stone descended into depths that her eyes couldn't penetrate. Elswyth had discovered the opening yesterday, but hadn't had the courage to investigate. Now, with daylight streaming through the broken roof and her curiosity stronger than her caution, she found herself drawn to the edge of the hole. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, their edges rounded by ages of use. Someone had built this before the chapel above, before Christianity had claimed this valley. The darkness below seemed to whisper of secrets and old magic, of powers that predated the god who had failed to protect her from human cruelty. She lowered herself onto the first step, then the second. The stone was dry despite the recent storm, and she could feel air moving against her face, evidence of a larger space below. As she descended, her grandmother's pouch began to grow warm against her side, as if the herbs and tools within were responding to their proximity to whatever lay beneath the ruins. By the time she reached the bottom, Elswyth could barely see, but she could feel the space around her large and circular, with passages leading away in multiple directions. The air tasted of age and stone and something else, something that made her blood sing with recognition. This was where her journey would truly begin, though she didn't yet understand what she was walking toward. All she knew was that the loneliness that had driven her to seek solitude was about to lead her to discoveries that would change not just her life, but her understanding of what life could be. Above her, the ruined chapel settled into morning silence, keeping its vigil over secrets that were about to resurface after centuries of patient waiting. The darkness below wasn't empty. Elswyth's eyes adjusted slowly as she reached the bottom of the stone steps, revealing a circular chamber that predated anything she'd ever seen. The walls curved upward into shadows, carved with the same spiraling symbols that had warmed beneath her touch above. But here, they seemed to pulse with their own faint light, creating a constellation of ancient meaning that her mind couldn't quite grasp. The air moved strangely in this place, carrying whispers of wind that had no earthly source. It tasted of minerals and time, but underneath those familiar flavors lay something else, something that made her blood quicken with an excitement she couldn't name. 3 archways led from the chamber into passages that disappeared into absolute darkness. Each was framed with symbols different from those on the walls, and each seemed to hum with its own particular energy. The leftmost arch carried the scent of growing things, of earth and rain and new life. The right spoke of fire and forge work, of creation through destruction. But it was the center passage that called to her, breathing air that tasted of starlight and dreams. Elswyth approached the central archway with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. The symbols here were more complex, interweaving patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. As she stepped through, the carved limestone beneath her feet gave way to something older, smooth stone that had been worked by hands that understood arts lost to the modern world. The passage sloped gently downward, lit by the same inexplicable phosphorescence that had illuminated the chamber above. Her grandmother's pouch grew warmer with each step, the herbs and tools within responding to whatever power flowed through this place. After what felt like an eternity of walking, the passage opened into a vast underground hall. Elswyth's breath caught in her throat at the sight before her. The space was enormous, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. Massive stone columns supported the weight of the earth overhead, each one carved with flowing patterns that seemed to tell stories in a language she almost remembered. Between the columns lay what had once been an altar or shrine, its original purpose obscured by time, but its significance unmistakable. And chained to that altar, silver bonds gleaming even in the dim light, lay a figure that made her heart stop. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across a face carved from marble and shadows. The chains that bound him were not merely metal but art, worked silver, formed into intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the phosphorescent glow. They wrapped around his wrists and ankles, across his chest and throat, holding him motionless against the ancient stone. But it was his stillness that struck her most profoundly. Not the stillness of sleep or unconsciousness, but the absolute quiet of something that had stopped participating in the flow of time. His chest didn't rise or fall. His eyelids didn't flutter. Even his hair lay perfectly motionless, as if the very air around him had forgotten how to move. The carved limestone slab beneath him bore an inscription in letters that hurt to look at directly. As Elswyth approached, she could make out fragments of meaning, words that spoke of binding and sleep, of punishment and protection. The stone itself seemed to pulse with contained energy, as if it were struggling to maintain whatever spell held the figure captive. This was no Christian monument. This was something far older, something that reached back to times when different powers had walked the earth. The very air around the altar thrummed with contained magic, making her skin tingle and her blood sing with recognition. She should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee this place and never speak of what she'd found. The villagers' warnings about cursed ground suddenly seemed less like superstition and more like hard-won wisdom. Whatever lay before her was dangerous enough that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to contain it. But Elswyth didn't run. Instead, she found herself drawn closer, her feet carrying her forward despite her mind's protests. The loneliness that had become her constant companion over these months of exile reached out toward the figure on the altar, recognizing something achingly familiar in his isolation. He was trapped as surely as she was, bound by forces beyond his control and cut off from everything that had once given his existence meaning. The silver chains might be more literal than her social exile, but the essential truth was the same. They were both prisoners of other people's fears. As she approached the altar, details became clearer. His clothes were unlike anything she'd seen, cut from fabric that seemed to shimmer with its own light. The style was foreign but elegant, speaking of nobility and power that transcended any earthly rank. His hands, bound at the wrists, were long-fingered and graceful, the hands of someone accustomed to wielding authority with precision. But it was his face that held her captive. Even in his unnatural sleep, there was a dignity about him that spoke of suffering borne with courage, of losses endured without breaking. The lines around his eyes suggested ages of experience, while the set of his mouth hinted at both strength and surprising gentleness. She reached out without conscious thought, her fingertips barely brushing the silver chain that crossed his forehead. The metal burned like ice against her skin, and she jerked her hand back with a gasp. But in that instant of contact, she'd felt something else, a flicker of awareness deep within the bound figure, like a candle guttering in a vast darkness. He wasn't dead or even truly unconscious. He was simply held in a state between being and not being, aware but unable to act. The cruelty of such a fate struck her like a physical blow. To be conscious but helpless, aware but unable to move or speak or even breathe, it was torture refined to an art form. Whatever this man had done to deserve such punishment, 3 centuries of it seemed excessive by any measure. Her hands moved to the chains before she could stop them, fingers tracing the intricate patterns worked into the silver. The metal was warm now, responding to her touch in ways that defied all natural law. Where her skin contacted the chains, they seemed to loosen slightly, as if her very presence was disrupting whatever power held them fast. The inscription on the stone began to glow more brightly, symbols rearranging themselves in patterns that spoke of warnings and prohibitions. The altar itself seemed to resist her efforts, the ancient magic within it, recognizing a threat to its long vigil. But Elswyth's own power was rising now, called forth by proximity to magics that resonated with something deep in her blood. The warmth that had saved little Sarah flowed through her hands into the silver chains, and she felt them respond like living things, loosening their grip on their ancient prisoner. She should have hesitated, should have considered the consequences of freeing something that others had deemed dangerous enough to bind for centuries, should have wondered what manner of creature required such elaborate containment. Instead, she thought of her own exile, her own punishment for powers she hadn't chosen and couldn't control. She thought of the villagers' fear and Father Benedict's righteous fury, and how quickly help could become heresy in the eyes of those too frightened to see clearly. The silver chain around his left wrist came free with a sound like breaking glass. Then the right. The bonds across his chest loosened and fell away, leaving only the chain around his throat, the final seal that held him in his timeless sleep. Elswyth's hands trembled as she reached for that last binding. Once she freed him completely, there would be no undoing what she'd done. Whatever consequences followed would be hers to bear. But as her fingers closed around the silver links, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. For the first time in months, she was choosing to act rather than simply endure. For the first time since her exile, she was reaching toward connection rather than accepting isolation. The final chain dissolved beneath her touch like morning frost before sunlight, and the figure on the altar drew his first breath in 300 years. The first thing Lucien noticed wasn't the absence of chains or the return of sensation to his limbs. It was the scent of lavender and chamomile, herbs that spoke of healing and gentle care. The second thing he noticed was warmth, not the artificial heat of forge or flame, but the living warmth of human compassion. He opened his eyes to find a woman kneeling beside the altar, her hands still glowing with the fading remnants of whatever power had broken his bonds. Her face was lined with the kind of suffering that aged the soul more than years, but her eyes held a kindness that made his long-dead heart remember what it felt like to hope. And in those eyes he saw an echo of another face, one that had shown him mercy when the world offered only hatred. Mirren? The name escaped his lips as barely a whisper, a question and a prayer wrapped in a single word. The woman's breath caught. That was my grandmother's name. How could you possibly? She stopped, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Who are you? Lucien tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. 3 centuries of immobility had left his body weak as a newborn's, though he could already feel supernatural healing beginning to restore what time and binding had stolen. Still, the effort of simply raising his head sent waves of dizziness through his consciousness. "Forgive me," he managed, his voice rough from disuse. "I am Lucien Corvus, and I owe you a debt that spans lifetimes." He paused, studying her face more carefully, seeing past the evidence of hardship to the bone structure beneath. "You have her eyes, Mirren's eyes, and her hands." The woman, Mirren's granddaughter, pulled back slightly, wariness replacing wonder in her expression. "My grandmother died 20 years ago. You speak of her as if you knew her, but that's impossible unless I'm not human," Lucien finished quietly. "Which I am not, though I was once. Your grandmother saved my life when others would have watched me burn. She saw past what I had become to remember what I had been. Memory crystals weren't visible things in this world, but Lucien could feel them anyway, fragments of the past that had sustained him through centuries of enforced sleep. He focused on one now, letting the remembrance flow through him with painful clarity. "It was during the plague years," he said, his eyes distant with recollection. "Not the recent outbreak that drove you from your village, but the great dying that came before your birth. I had been turned only a handful of years before, still learning what I had become, still fighting the hunger that came with this curse." The woman's hand moved instinctively to the leather pouch at her side, the same gesture Mirren had made when nervous or thinking deeply. The similarity struck him like a physical blow. "I collapsed in the forest outside Millhaven, weakened by hunger but refusing to feed on innocence. Your grandmother found me there, fevered, delirious, barely holding on to sanity. She should have run, should have gathered the village men to finish what the hunger was doing to me naturally. Instead," Lucien remembered, Mirren had knelt beside him in the mud and rain, her hands glowing with the same gentle power he'd just witnessed in her granddaughter. She'd seen through his monstrous nature to the man underneath, the nobleman who had been transformed against his will into something he never wanted to be. She brought me to her cottage and nursed me back to strength, fed me broth when I could barely swallow, sat with me through nights when the hunger almost broke my resolve. She never asked what I was or why my skin was cold as winter stone. She simply saw someone in need and chose compassion over fear. The memory grew more vivid as he spoke, details surfacing that 3 centuries hadn't dimmed. She had a small garden behind her home, full of herbs I'd never seen before. When I asked about them, she smiled and said her own grandmother had taught her that every growing thing had gifts to offer if you knew how to ask properly. She made me tea from leaves that shouldn't have grown in this climate, and somehow it eased the worst of the hunger. Miran's granddaughter was listening with the absolute stillness of someone hearing a beloved voice from beyond the grave. She used to say that healing wasn't about forcing change, but about helping things remember what they were meant to be. Those were her exact words to me, Lucien confirmed. She said, I'd been changed against my nature, but that didn't mean I had to surrender my humanity. She helped me find ways to feed without killing, showed me how certain animals could provide what I needed without harm if approached with respect rather than predation. For 3 weeks, Miran had sheltered him while he learned to control what he'd become. She'd never asked for payment or praise, never demanded explanations for things that defied natural law. She'd simply extended kindness to a creature that the rest of the world would have destroyed without question. But someone discovered what I was, Lucien continued, his voice growing darker. Father Matthias Benedict's predecessor had been watching your grandmother's cottage. When he saw what she was harboring, he raised the village against us both. The ending hadn't been kind. Lucien had been forced to flee before sunset, leaving Miran to face accusations of consorting with demons. She'd never denied helping him, even when they threatened her with fire. Instead, she'd calmly explained that healing was her calling, and she wouldn't abandon it for anyone's fear. She told them that mercy was the highest virtue, and that God would judge her more harshly for turning away someone in need than for showing kindness to something they didn't understand. They branded her a heretic that night, but they didn't dare burn her. Too many people owed their lives to her skills. She never told me about you, Miran's granddaughter said softly. But she did say that healing sometimes meant accepting things that others couldn't understand. She said our family carried old blood, older than the village, older than the church. Lucien managed to prop himself up on his elbows, though the effort cost him dearly. What's your name? I cannot continue calling you by your grandmother's, though the resemblance is uncanny. Elswyth, she replied. And I've been cast out just as she was, though for different reasons. Or perhaps the same ones, if what you're suggesting about our blood is true. The power I felt when you broke my chains, Lucien said carefully. It wasn't just human will or learned skill. There's magic in your bloodline, Elswyth. Old magic that predates the church and the village, and perhaps even this land itself. Miran had it too, though she was more careful about how she used it. Elswyth's hand tightened on her grandmother's pouch. Then the villagers were right to fear me. No, Lucien said with surprising firmness for someone barely strong enough to sit upright. They were right to sense your power, but fear was their choice, not their destiny. Your grandmother taught me that there's a difference between being dangerous and being evil. You freed me when you had no reason to trust me, showed mercy to something that might have destroyed you. That speaks to character, not curse. He could see her struggling with this revelation, just as he had struggled centuries ago when Miran first suggested that his transformation didn't have to define his moral choices. You said, I have old blood, Elswyth said finally. What does that mean? Lucien smiled, remembering another conversation in another lifetime. It means, dear Elswyth, that this is only the beginning. Over the following days, as Lucien slowly regained his strength, Elswyth found herself caring for someone who challenged everything she thought she knew about monsters and men. He was nothing like the village tales, suggested vampires should be no slavering beast driven by bloodlust, no creature of pure malevolence seeking to corrupt innocent souls. Instead, he was thoughtful and gentle, moving through her makeshift shelter with the careful courtesy of a guest who understood he was receiving undeserved kindness. When she brought him broth made from herbs and stream water, he accepted it with genuine gratitude. When she offered him her only blanket against the underground chill, he refused with such quiet dignity that she found herself respecting him more than most of the men she'd known in life. On the third evening, as they sat beside the small fire she'd built near the altar, Lucien began to share stories of the world as it had been centuries ago. He spoke of kingdoms that had risen and fallen, of plagues that had reshaped entire continents, of the slow dance between human progress and supernatural forces that most people never suspected existed. "The chains that bound me," he said, absently rubbing his wrists where the silver had left faint marks, "they weren't forged by the villagers. This magic is far older than Millhaven, older than the chapel above us. Someone with real power wanted me contained." Elswyth looked up from the simple meal she was preparing. "Who? I'm not certain. The binding spell was triggered during the night they came for your grandmother. I remember Father Matthias raising his silver crucifix, speaking words in a language that predated Latin. The next thing I knew, I was waking to your touch." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "But I suspect whoever set that spell knew our bloodlines would cross again eventually." The notion troubled her more than she cared to admit. "You're suggesting this was all planned? That my finding you wasn't coincidence?" Lucien reached into the folds of his strange clothing and withdrew something that made Elswyth's breath catch. It was a ring, simple silver set, with a stone that seemed to capture and hold the firelight. She recognized it instantly, though she hadn't seen it in 20 years. "Your grandmother gave this to me before I fled," he said, holding it out to her. "She said her granddaughter would need it someday, when the old powers stirred again. She made me promise to keep it safe until that day came." Elswyth took the ring with trembling fingers. It was warm to the touch, warmer than metal should be after centuries of separation from living hands. As she slipped it onto her finger, she felt something shift inside her, a settling, as if pieces of herself she hadn't known were missing had suddenly clicked into place. "She knew," Elswyth whispered. "Somehow, she knew this would happen." "Mirren was a seer as well as a healer," Lucien confirmed. "She could read the threads of possibility that connected present to future. She told me once that our family lines, yours and mine, were bound together by something older than either of our peoples, that we would find each other again when the world needed what we could offer together." The ring pulsed gently against her skin, and suddenly Elswyth could feel things she'd never noticed before. The life force of every growing thing within miles called to her consciousness. The natural springs that fed the underground chamber sang with their own crystalline voices. Even Lucien himself registered differently now, not as the cold, unnatural thing her fear had expected, but as something transformed yet fundamentally unchanged at its core. "What did she mean by our peoples?" Elswyth asked. Lucien was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Your family carries the blood of the old healers, those who could work with life force itself, who could encourage growth and mending and renewal. My family descends from the Guardians warriors who were meant to protect such healers from those who would misuse their gifts." He looked up at her, and she saw ancient pain in his eyes. "I was transformed by someone who sought to corrupt that protection into possession, turned into a creature that would hunger for the very thing I was born to defend." The pieces of a larger story began to arrange themselves in Elswyth's mind. "The plague years, the recent outbreak that killed my husband, it wasn't natural, was it? No. Someone with power over death and decay sent it to flush out any remaining old blood in this region. Your healing of little Sarah marked you as clearly as a beacon fire." That's why Father Benedict moved against you so quickly." Elswyth felt the ring grow warmer against her skin, responding to her rising anger. "Then everything I've suffered, Thomas's death, my exile, months of living like an animal, it was all orchestrated by someone I've never even met." "I believe so. And I believe whoever did this expected you to die in exile, removing the last threat to whatever they're planning." Lucien leaned forward, his expression intense. "But instead you found me. And now we have a chance to understand what we're truly facing." That night, as Lucien rested and began the slow process of rebuilding strength that 3 centuries of binding had stolen, Elswyth found herself unable to sleep. She sat at the edge of their sanctuary, looking up through the ruined chapel toward stars she couldn't see, but somehow felt watching. The ring on her finger pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and with each pulse she felt more connected to the world around her. Not just the immediate environment of stone and water and growing things, but to something vast and ancient that flowed beneath the surface of ordinary reality. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Not in the village that had rejected her, not in the civilized world that feared what she represented, but in this liminal space between mortal and supernatural, between past and future. When Lucien woke the next morning, he found her sitting in the same spot, but changed. The uncertainty that had marked her movements was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that reminded him powerfully of Mirren. "You've accepted it," he said, not really a question. "I've accepted that running from what I am hasn't made anyone safer," Elswyth replied. "Not me, not the villagers, not anyone. Maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting back." Lucien smiled, and for the first time since his awakening, it wasn't tinged with sadness. "Your grandmother would be proud." Above them, carried on wind that shouldn't have reached so far underground, came the distant sound of church bells tolling from Millhaven. But instead of calling the faithful to prayer, their rhythm spoke of alarm and gathering storm. Something was stirring in the village, and whatever it was, Elswyth and Lucien would face it together. The church bells had been tolling for 3 days straight, their bronze voices carrying across the valley with an urgency that made Elswyth's newly awakened senses recoil. Each peal sent ripples through the supernatural currents she could now perceive, disrupting the natural flow of energy that connected all living things in the region. "They're not calling people to worship," Lucien observed, his strength nearly fully restored after a week of careful recovery. "That's a summoning pattern, old ceremonial magic disguised as Christian ritual." Elswyth touched the iron brand that hung from a chain around her neck, another artifact she'd discovered in the ruins, though this one radiated menace rather than protection. The crude tool had been forged for marking heretics, its surface scarred by years of cruel use. She'd found it half buried, near what had once been the chapel's sacristy, and something about its presence had seemed important enough to keep. "Father Benedict?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Or whoever is truly pulling his strings. Benedict strikes me as a tool, rather than a craftsman, zealous enough to be useful, but lacking the knowledge for this kind of working." Lucien moved to the chamber's edge, where natural fissures in the stone allowed sound to travel from the world above. "Listen, do you hear the harmony underneath the bells?" Elswyth joined him, pressing her ear to the cool stone. At first she heard only the expected bronze clamour, but gradually her enhanced perceptions picked up something else, a low, thrumming note that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a sound that spoke of binding and compulsion, of wills bent to serve purposes they didn't understand. "They're gathering the villagers," she realized with growing horror. "Not just for a meeting, but for something that requires their combined life force. A ritual of significant power, yes, and I suspect we're the intended sacrifice." The thought should have terrified her. Instead, Elswyth felt anger rising like a tide, fed by months of injustice and the growing understanding of how completely she'd been manipulated. The ring on her finger pulsed with warmth, responding to her emotional state, and she felt power flowing through her that made the air itself seem to shimmer. "Then we need to understand what we're truly facing," she said, turning back toward the altar where they'd been examining the ancient texts Lucien had retrieved from hidden alcoves throughout the chamber. Over the past several days, as Lucien had grown stronger, he'd revealed the true scope of the underground complex. What she'd initially taken for a simple crypt was actually a vast library and sanctuary, built by those who had understood that knowledge itself could be a weapon against ignorance and fear. The books were old beyond measure, their pages inscribed in languages that predated any writing system she knew. But with the ring's influence, many of the symbols had begun to make sense, revealing histories that the surface world had forgotten or deliberately obscured. "Here," Lucien said, opening a tome bound in what looked like scales rather than leather. "This chronicles the last great persecution, the systematic hunting of anyone carrying old blood. It happened 5 centuries ago, when the Church first gained enough power to challenge the ancient families directly. The illustrations were haunting, images of burning villages, of families torn apart, of knowledge destroyed and wisdom scattered to the winds. But most disturbing were the depictions of the hunters themselves, figures in religious garb, wielding powers that seemed distinctly unholy for servants of a supposedly benevolent god. They didn't just kill the old blood families," Elswyth read, her finger tracing text that seemed to write itself as she touched it. "They consumed their power, twisted it to serve their own purposes. The very abilities they claimed were demonic. They appropriated for their war against the supernatural world. And now they're trying to complete what was started centuries ago," Lucien confirmed grimly. "Your emergence as a healer, strong enough to reverse plague, marked you as a threat that couldn't be ignored. But rather than simply kill you, they've been using you as bait." The pattern was becoming clear. Her exile hadn't been random cruelty, it had been carefully orchestrated to drive her to this place, to these ruins where they expected her to die alone and forgotten. They'd underestimated her resilience, and they certainly hadn't anticipated her, freeing an ally with centuries of experience fighting their kind. "The question is," Elswyth said, studying a map that showed the underground complex extending far beyond what they'd yet explored, "how much time do we have before they make their move?" As if summoned by her words, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the stone staircase from the ruined chapel above. Multiple sets of boots, moving with the coordination of trained soldiers rather than fearful villagers. Lucien was on his feet instantly, his enhanced senses reading threats that were still beyond Elswyth's perception. Armed men, at least a dozen, possibly more. They're moving carefully but confidently, they know exactly where they're going. Then they've been here before, Elswyth realized. This was never a lost ruin. They've been using it, maintaining it, preparing it for whatever they have planned. The footsteps were growing closer, accompanied now by the low murmur of voices speaking in the same ancient language that appeared in the texts around them. But where the written words had carried the weight of preserved wisdom, these spoken phrases dripped with corruption and twisted purpose. "We need to go deeper," Lucien said, gathering the most important books while Elswyth secured her grandmother's pouch and the few supplies they'd accumulated. "There are passages that lead to older sections of the complex chambers they may not know about." But as they moved toward the passages leading away from the main chamber, light began to filter down from above. Not the natural illumination of torches or lanterns, but a harsh, artificial radiance that made the ancient symbols on the walls recoil as if in pain. "Consecrated light," Lucien hissed, his supernatural nature causing him visible discomfort as the glow intensified. "They're not just hunting us. They're sanctifying the space, trying to turn our sanctuary into a trap." Elswyth felt the ring on her finger grow cold, its protective warmth struggling against whatever blessing was being forced upon the chamber above. The very air around them began to thicken, as if the space itself was being compressed by competing magical forces. "The central passage," she said, remembering the path that had led her to Lucian originally. "It goes deeper than the others, and the symbols there were different, older than whatever power they're wielding." They moved quickly but quietly through the winding corridor, the sound of pursuit growing fainter but not disappearing entirely. Behind them, the harsh light continued to spread, and Elswyth could feel the ancient protections that had guarded this place for centuries beginning to weaken under the sustained assault. Whatever was coming, they would meet it in the deep places where older powers still held sway. But first, they needed to understand exactly what they were fighting and whether they had any hope of winning against enemies who had been preparing for this confrontation far longer than either of them had realized. The deeper passages led them through chambers that predated anything Elswyth had imagined possible. Here, the carved symbols gave way to something older, pictographs that seemed to move in her peripheral vision, telling stories of a time when the boundary between human and supernatural had been fluid rather than absolute. Lucien moved ahead of her, his vampiric senses allowing him to navigate the darkness with confidence. But it was Elswyth who stopped before the most significant discovery, a chamber whose entrance was flanked by statues she recognized despite their impossible age. "These figures," she said, running her fingers over stone worn smooth by millennia, "they're wearing the same ring I am." The statues depicted men and women in flowing robes, their hands raised in gestures of blessing or protection. Each wore a simple silver band set with a stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light, even rendered in ancient granite. "The original covenant," Lucien said softly. "I've heard stories, but I never thought to see proof with my own eyes." Beyond the statues lay what could only be described as a library, but one devoted to knowledge that the surface world had forgotten or forbidden. The walls were lined with alcoves containing scrolls, tablets, and books that represented the accumulated wisdom of the old families. And at the chamber's heart sat a reading desk carved from a single piece of obsidian, upon which rested a leather-bound journal that looked disturbingly recent compared to everything else around it. Elswyth approached the journal with the reverence due to something sacred. As her fingers touched the cover, she felt a familiar presence, not quite her grandmother's touch, but something closely related to it. "The Chronicle of Shadows," she read from the cover, the words appearing in her own language, despite being written in the same ancient script they'd been deciphering. "A record of the hidden history of Millhaven and the covenant that protected it." She opened the journal to its first page and found an inscription that made her heart stop. "For my granddaughter, who will need to understand what we truly are." Written by Mirren Ashworth in the final year of her life. The pages that followed contained revelations that recontextualized everything Elswyth thought she knew about her family's place in the world. Her grandmother hadn't simply been a gifted healer working at the margins of acceptable society. She had been the last guardian of a covenant that stretched back to the founding of Millhaven itself. The village was built on a convergence of natural power lines, she read aloud, her voice echoing in the ancient chamber. A place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, where those with old blood could work greater healings than anywhere else in the region. The first settlers understood this, and they built their community around protecting and nurturing that gift. Lucien leaned over her shoulder, reading along with growing amazement. The church didn't drive out the old ways it was founded to shelter them. The original father was one of the covenant members, chosen specifically because his religious authority could shield the others from persecution by outside forces. But the protection hadn't lasted forever. As the chronicle continued, it detailed the gradual corruption of that original purpose. New priests arrived, who saw supernatural abilities as threats rather than gifts. Political pressures from distant bishops forced changes in doctrine. Fear of the Inquisition led to ever greater restrictions on what kinds of healing could be practiced openly. Father Matthias was the first to actively hunt the Covenant members. Elswyth discovered, reading about events that had occurred during her grandmother's youth. But even he was constrained by the community's memory of how much they owed to the old families. He could persecute individuals, but he couldn't move against the entire bloodline. The chronicle's most disturbing revelation came in its final entries, written in Mirren's careful hand just months before her death. Benedict is not what he appears to be. His ordination papers are forgeries, his knowledge of church doctrine superficial, but his understanding of binding magic and blood rituals is extensive. He has come here for a specific purpose, to complete the work that Matthias began. Lucian cursed in a language that predated Latin, his fangs extending slightly as his anger rose. She knew they would come for you. Eventually. She knew, and she prepared what defenses she could. But it wasn't enough, Elswyth said, reading the chronicle's final entry with growing dread. She could see the threads of possibility, but she couldn't change them. All she could do was leave me tools and hope I would be strong enough to use them when the time came. The last pages of the chronicle contained detailed maps of the underground complex, showing chambers and passages that even Lucien hadn't known existed. But more importantly, they revealed the true purpose of the ruins above, not just a forgotten chapel, but the physical anchor point for a network of protective wards that had kept supernatural predators away from Millhaven for centuries. The bells, Elswyth realized with sudden clarity. They're not just calling people to ritual, they're disrupting the ward network. If they succeed in breaking the protections completely, this entire region will be open to whatever they want to summon, and with the old blood families eliminated, there would be no one left who could restore the barriers, Lucien added grimly. They're not just destroying us, they're clearing the way for something much worse. The sound of pursuit had grown distant, but Elswyth could feel the consecrated light continuing to spread through the passages above them. Whatever ritual was being performed in the ruined chapel was gaining power, and she could sense the ancient protections failing one by one. But here, in this deepest chamber, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of her ancestors, she felt something else stirring. The ring on her finger pulsed with warmth that seemed to draw strength from the very stones around them. The power that had been growing within her since her exile suddenly felt less like a curse and more like a calling. "There's something else," she said, finding a hidden compartment in the obsidian reading desk. Inside lay a second ring, similar to her own, but bearing a different stone, one that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. For the guardian who would stand beside the healer when the old darkness returned. Lucien took the ring with hands that trembled slightly. As he slipped it onto his finger, the chamber around them seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for centuries, waiting for this moment. "Your grandmother saw farther than I thought possible," he said, his voice filled with wonder and growing determination. "She knew we would find each other here, knew we would have to make our stand in this place." Above them, the sound of chanting grew louder, and Elswyth could feel the ward network beginning its final collapse. But for the first time since her exile began, she felt ready for whatever was coming. "Then let's give them the fight they've been planning for," she said, and meant it completely. The soul mirror revealed itself without ceremony, emerging from a hidden alcove as Elswyth and Lucien prepared to face whatever forces waited above. It was a simple thing, a disk of polished obsidian set into a frame of the same silver that had comprised Lucien's chains. But when Elswyth looked into its depths, she saw not her own reflection, but something that shattered every assumption she'd built about herself and her place in the world. The face looking back at her was familiar yet impossible. It was her own features, but refined and ethereal in a way that spoke of bloodlines far older than humanity itself. Her eyes held depths that seemed to contain starlight, and her skin bore faint markings that resembled the protective symbols carved throughout the ancient chambers. "That's not possible," she whispered, But even as she spoke, she felt the truth of it settling into her bones, like recognition of a song she'd always known but never heard clearly. Lucienne appeared beside her in the mirror's surface, and she saw how their reflections complemented each other in ways that went beyond mere physical compatibility. Where her image spoke of growth and healing and the nurturing aspects of supernatural power, his reflected protection and strength, and the fierce devotion of those born to stand guard over precious things. "Your grandmother never told you," he said softly, his voice filled with wonder and growing understanding. "She couldn't tell you because the knowledge itself would have been dangerous until you were strong enough to bear it." The mirror's surface rippled, and suddenly Elswyth was seeing beyond her own reflection into memories that belonged to bloodlines, stretching back to the dawn of the supernatural world. She watched her ancestors moving through forests that predated human settlement, working magic that shaped the very landscape to nurture and protect mortal communities. "We're not human," she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue but absolutely true. "We never were human. Not entirely, no. Your family carries the blood of the Sidhe, the ancient ones, who chose to bind themselves to mortal realms rather than retreat to the otherworld when humanity began to dominate the earth. My bloodline descends from those who were chosen to protect such bridges between worlds." The mirror showed her more images of the first covenant ceremonies, where beings like her ancestors had willingly limited their power in exchange for the ability to help mortal communities flourish. They had become healers and wise women, herbalists and midwives, using carefully constrained abilities to ease suffering and encourage growth. But the price of such binding was that each generation became more mortal, more vulnerable to the fears and prejudices of those they served. What had begun as conscious sacrifice had become, over centuries, a gradual forgetting of their true nature. The exile wasn't random, Elswyth realized, pieces of a vast puzzle clicking into place. They needed me isolated, desperate enough to descend into these ruins where the ancient protections would strip away the bindings that kept my true nature dormant. And freeing me completed the awakening process, Lucienne confirmed. The original covenant required both healer and guardian to function at full strength. Alone, we're powerful, but limited. Together, we become something that threatens anyone who profits from keeping the supernatural world weak and divided. The mirror's surface shimmered again, and this time it showed them Father Benedict, as he truly was not the ambitious but fundamentally human priest they'd imagined, but something wearing human form like an ill-fitting disguise. His true shape was shadow-given substance, fed by fear and conflict and the deliberate corruption of sacred spaces. "A devourer," Lucian breathed, his hand instinctively moving toward weapons he no longer carried. "I should have sensed what he was, but the binding weakened my perceptions. Devourers were parasitic entities that fed on the life force of supernatural beings, growing stronger by consuming what they destroyed. They were ancient enemies of both the Sidhe and their guardian allies, drawn to places where old powers still flowed like sharks to blood in the water. "He's been here for years," Elswyth realized, watching the mirror show her glimpses of Benedict's true activities in Millhaven. Not just hunting me, but systematically draining anyone with even trace amounts of supernatural heritage. The plague wasn't natural. It was a feeding process, designed to weaken the community's spiritual defenses while providing him with nourishment. The images in the mirror shifted to show the villagers as they currently were, not the fearful but essentially good people she remembered, but hollow shells whose life force had been gradually consumed over months of exposure to Benedict's influence. They gathered now in the chapel above, not out of religious fervor, but because they no longer possessed enough autonomous will to resist his commands. "Thomas," she whispered, seeing her husband's final days with new understanding, "he wasn't dying of plague. Benedict was draining him, using him to get closer to me." The cruelty of it struck her like a physical blow. Her husband's death, her exile, months of loneliness and despair, all of it orchestrated by a creature that fed on precisely such suffering. Benedict hadn't just destroyed her life, he'd arranged events to maximize the pain and isolation that would drive her to this moment. But as her anger rose, something else stirred within her. The power that had been growing since her exile suddenly blazed to full strength, no longer constrained by the mental barriers that had kept her Sidhe heritage dormant. The ring on her finger grew warm enough to glow, and the ancient symbols carved into the chamber walls began to respond with their own radiant energy. "He made a mistake," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there moments before. "By awakening my true nature, he's given me access to power he can't drain or corrupt. And by revealing his true form, he's shown me exactly what needs to be destroyed." Lucienne felt the change in her immediately, the shift from mortal woman with supernatural abilities to something far more fundamental and dangerous. The guardian instincts bred into his bloodline responded to her transformation, and he felt his own vampiric nature evolving in response. "The covenant our ancestors made," he said, understanding flooding through him as his guardian ring pulsed with answering light. It wasn't just about limiting power to serve mortals. It was about creating a weapon that could defend against things like Benedict beings that view all life as potential food. The mirror showed them one final image, the ward network that protected not just Millhaven, but dozens of similar communities throughout the region. Benedict's ritual wasn't just about destroying local protections. It was the first stage of a much larger plan to strip away supernatural defenses across multiple kingdoms, leaving vast populations vulnerable to predation by his kind. "How many others like him are there?" Elswyth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Enough," Lucienne replied grimly, "and they've been planning this for longer than either of us has been alive. But they didn't account for the covenant bonds surviving the persecution of our bloodlines. They expected to face us individually as refugees and exiles." Above them, the chanting reached a crescendo, and Elswyth felt the final wardstone begin to crack. Soon, Benedict would complete his ritual and begin the next phase of whatever dark plan required, the spiritual desolation of an entire region. "Instead, they're going to face us as we were meant to be," she said, her newly awakened nature settling around her like armor forged from starlight and ancient oaths. As partners bound by powers older than their hunger. The mirror's surface went dark, its purpose fulfilled. But Elswyth no longer needed its revelations to understand what she had become. The truth blazed within her now, undeniable and transformative. She was Sidhe-born, heir to obligations and abilities that stretched back to the world's youth. And the hollow creature wearing Father Benedict's face was about to learn why her ancestors had been both revered and feared by those who knew their true nature. "Are you ready?" Lucienne asked, his own transformation complete as guardian instincts melded seamlessly with vampiric strength. Elswyth smiled, and for the first time since her exile began, it held no trace of uncertainty or fear. "Let's go remind him why our kinds were bound together in the first place." The ward stones had begun to sing. As Elswyth and Lucienne made their way through the deepest passages of the ancient complex, the protective markers that had safeguarded Millhaven for centuries were crying out in harmonies of distress and approaching failure. Each stone's voice was distinct, some deep as mountain roots, others bright as starlight, but all carried the same message of boundaries stretched beyond their capacity to hold. "The network is collapsing in sequence," Lucienne observed, his enhanced senses reading the supernatural currents that flowed through the underground chambers. "Benedict isn't just overwhelming the protections, he's unraveling them systematically, stone by stone." Elswyth felt each failure like a physical wound, her newly awakened Sidhe nature, making her acutely aware of the damage being done to the spiritual infrastructure her ancestors had spent generations creating. The ward stones weren't simply magical constructs, they were living repositories of sacrifice and dedication, each one anchored by oaths sworn in blood and starlight. "He knows exactly what he's doing," she said, her voice tight with anger and growing determination. "This isn't random destruction, it's a precise dismantling of everything our people built to protect this region." They emerged into a circular chamber she hadn't seen before, its walls lined with alcoves containing crystals that pulsed with failing light. This was the heart of the ward network, the central nexus from which protective energy flowed to every settlement within 100 miles. And at the chamber's center stood something that made her breath catch in recognition and despair. The Master Ward stone towered above them, a pillar of carved granite and embedded crystal that reached from floor to invisible ceiling. Its surface was covered with names, thousands upon thousands of them, carved in scripts that spanned millennia. Each name represented someone who had given part of their life force to maintain the protections, creating a legacy of sacrifice that stretched back to the first covenant ceremonies. But now, cracks were spreading across that ancient surface like infection through healthy tissue. With each pulse of Benedict's ritual above, more names disappeared into fracture lines, and more of the protective energy bled away into nothingness. "My grandmother's name is there," Elswyth realized, spotting familiar letters carved in a script that was nearly contemporary. "And my great-grandmother's, my entire family line, going back." She stopped, seeing markings that predated written language as she understood it. Going back to the beginning, Lucien found his own family's contributions etched into the stone's base, where guardian names were recorded alongside those they had sworn to protect. The sight filled him with a complex mixture of pride and responsibility that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained emotional control. "If Benedict completes his ritual," he said quietly, "all of this ends, not just the protections, but the memory of what was sacrificed to create them. Every name on this stone, every oath sworn in service to something greater than individual survival, it all becomes meaningless." Above them, the chanting had taken on a rhythm that Elswyth recognized from her grandmother's most private teachings. But where Mirren had used similar patterns to encourage healing and growth, Benedict was employing them to sever connections and drain vitality. The sacred was being perverted into its exact opposite, love twisted into hunger, protection corrupted into predation. "How long do we have?" she asked, though she could feel the answer in the accelerating failure of the ward network. "Minutes, perhaps. The Master Stone is fighting him, but it was designed to channel willing sacrifice, not to resist active corruption. Once he breaks the central anchor, the entire network will collapse simultaneously." Elswyth placed her hands against the cracked stone, feeling the pain of its slow destruction resonating through her bones. But she also felt something else, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. The ward stone knew her, had been waiting for her, had been designed by her ancestors specifically for this moment when everything they'd built would stand on the edge of annihilation. It's not just a repository, she realized, her Sidhe heritage allowing her to perceive layers of meaning that had been hidden from her mortal perspective. It's a test, a final safeguard that can only be activated by someone carrying the original bloodlines. The knowledge flowed into her consciousness, like water finding its proper channel. The Master Ward Stone contained not just the accumulated sacrifice of generations, but a fail-safe mechanism built by the first Sidhe who had chosen to bind themselves to mortal realms. If the network ever faced complete destruction, someone of pure enough heritage could activate a reset, rebuilding all the protections at once, but at a cost that would forever change the nature of the Guardian Covenant. "What kind of cost?" Lucien asked, his guardian instincts reading the sudden tension in her posture. Elswyth closed her eyes, letting the stone's accumulated wisdom flow through her consciousness. The original binding was meant to limit Sidhe power to levels that wouldn't threaten mortal communities, but the reset requires full activation of that power permanently. There's no going back to partial awakening, no pretending to be mostly human. And for the Guardian, bound to such a Sid, The transformation would be complete as well. Not just vampire with retained humanity, but something older and more fundamental. A true guardian of the old covenant, with all the responsibilities and isolation that entails. They would become what their ancestors had been, protectors and healers standing at the boundary between worlds, too powerful to integrate fully into mortal society, but too bound by ancient oaths to abandon it entirely. It was a kind of exile that made her current banishment seem trivial by comparison. But as the Master Ward Stone's pain flowed through her consciousness, Elswyth found that the prospect didn't frighten her as much as she'd expected. She'd already lost everything that had connected her to ordinary life. Thomas was dead, her place in Millhaven was gone forever, and the villagers she'd once served now gathered above her head as unwilling participants in her destruction. What she'd gained in return was a connection to something vast and meaningful that transcended individual mortality. She was part of a legacy that stretched back to the world's youth and forward to possibilities she could barely imagine. And she had found in Lucienne not just a companion but a complement, someone whose nature fitted with hers in ways that created something greater than either could be alone. "If we do this," Lucien said, his voice carefully controlled, "we'll be bound together by more than shared purpose. The Guardian Covenant isn't just professional alliance, it's a joining of life forces that makes both parties stronger but also fundamentally interdependent." "I know." Elswyth kept her hands pressed against the failing stone, feeling its pain like her own heartbreak. "Are you willing?" Above them, something shifted in the rhythm of Benedict's chanting. The ritual was entering its final phase, and she could feel the last protective barriers beginning their terminal collapse. Soon, nothing would stand between his kind and the communities they'd been feeding on for generations. But here, in the deepest chamber of the ancient complex, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and sacrifice of those who had faced similar choices, Elswyth felt a certainty that went beyond rational calculation. This was why she'd survived the plague, why she'd endured exile, why she'd been driven to these ruins where powers older than human civilization still held sway. This was why her grandmother had prepared her with tools and knowledge she hadn't understood at the time. This was why Lucien had been bound so near to where her awakening power would eventually draw her. Everything had been arranged by forces that could see farther into the patterns of possibility than mortal minds could comprehend. "The villagers," Lucien said suddenly. "If Benedict has been draining them for months, will restoring the ward network be enough to break his hold over them?" Elswyth let her consciousness extend toward the chapel above, reading the spiritual state of the people she'd once served. What she found there made her heart ache with fresh anger and determination. "They're not dead," she said, relief and fury warring in her voice. "Hollow, drained, but the core of who they were is still intact. Restoring the protections will cut off Benedict's access to their life force, and they should recover gradually. Then we have no choice." "No," Elswyth agreed and found that she was smiling. "We don't, and I find that I'm glad of it." Above them, the Master Ward Stone shuddered as another protection failed, sending cracks racing across its surface like lightning frozen in ancient granite. But Elswyth no longer saw those fissures as signs of defeat. Instead, they looked like preparation spaces where new energy could take root, where powers constrained for generations could finally grow into their intended strength. She looked at Lucien, seeing her own certainty reflected in his dark eyes. "Ready?" "Since the moment I first drew breath centuries ago," he replied, and meant it completely. Together, they placed their hands on the Master Ward Stone and began to sing the song her ancestors had been waiting generations for someone to remember. The consecrated blade sang through the air with the fury of perverted faith, its silver surface gleaming with benedictions that had been twisted into curses. Father Benedict, or the thing that wore his face, descended into the underground chamber with the confidence of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Behind him came the hollow-eyed villagers, moving with the jerky coordination of marionettes, guided by an inexpert hand. Among them, Elswyth recognized faces she had once healed. Margaret Thorne, whose son she had saved from fever. Old Henrik, who had spoken for her when the mob demanded her exile. Even young Peter, walking with the peculiar stiffness of someone whose will was no longer his own. "Did you truly think these ancient tunnels would hide you from me?" Benedict's voice carried harmonics that hurt to hear, each word layered with frequencies that bypassed conscious thought and struck directly at the soul. "I have been preparing for this moment since before you drew your first breath, child of the fading light." The transformation in the chapel above had been complete. Where once a human priest had stood ambitious and cruel but recognizably mortal, now loomed something that wore flesh like an ill-fitting garment. Benedict's true form bled through the human disguise. Shadow given substance, hunger refined into purpose, emptiness that sought to devour everything bright and warm in the world. Elswyth felt the song of awakening falter as the devourer's presence filled the chamber with spiritual poison. The masterward stone shuddered beneath her hands, its accumulated centuries of protective energy recoiling from contact with something designed to corrupt and consume such power. "You cannot complete the reset," Benedict continued, raising the consecrated blade until its point aimed directly at her heart. "The ritual requires willing sacrifice freely given, and I will ensure you die in terror and despair. Your power will feed me, and this entire region will become a banquet for my kind." But Lucien stepped between them, his guardian nature fully awakened now and blazing with protective fury that made the air itself shimmer. The vampire that Benedict had expected to face no longer existed. In its place stood something far more dangerous, a defender bound by ancient oaths to preserve what predators would destroy. "You mistake us for the broken remnants you've been hunting," Lucien said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries and the promise of violence that would not cease until the threat was ended. "We are not refugees fleeing your persecution. We are the Covenant reborn, and you have made the fundamental error of threatening what we were created to protect." The consecrated blade struck toward Lucien's chest with inhuman speed, but guardian reflexes honed by centuries of combat turned the blow aside. Silver scraped against something harder than steel as Lucien's transformed nature manifested armor that looked like moonlight given physical form. Benedict snarled, the sound emerging from a throat that no longer pretended to be entirely human. "Guardian magic will not save you here. This blade has been blessed with the accumulated hatred of every devourer that your kind has slain. It hungers for your blood as we hunger for the power that flows through these stones." Above them, the villagers began to chant in unison, their drained voices creating harmonics that resonated with the failing ward network. But the words they spoke were not prayers of protection. They were invocations designed to sever the connections between the spiritual realm and the physical world, cutting off the supernatural power that Elswyth needed to complete her awakening. "The people you've enslaved," Elswyth said, her hands still pressed against the master ward stone. "Despite the growing pain of Benedict's proximity, they're not just witnesses to your victory. They're part of the ritual itself." "Of course they are," Benedict replied, with the satisfaction of a predator that had planned every detail of its hunt. "Their life force will fuel the final severing, ensuring that no trace of the old protection survives. And their willing participation, however involuntary, will prevent any future covenant from taking root in this soil." The blade struck again, this time finding its mark as Lucien's guard dropped for an instant. Silver burned through supernatural flesh, and the guardian's cry of pain echoed through the chamber like a church bell tolling in reverse. But instead of falling, Lucien grasped the consecrated blade with his bare hands, accepting the agony of blessed metal against his transformed nature. "You understand nothing about what binds us," he said through gritted teeth, his grip on the blade tightening despite the spiritual fire that consumed his palms. You see only power to be consumed, connections to be severed. You cannot comprehend bonds that grow stronger under pressure. Elswyth felt Lucien's pain as if it were her own, the guardian bond they had forged, carrying his suffering directly into her consciousness. But instead of weakening her resolve, his sacrifice fed her determination. The song of awakening rose in her throat again, stronger now for being shared between them. "Impossible," Benedict hissed, seeing the light beginning to pulse more strongly from the Master Ward stone. "The blade should have severed your connection, should have left you helpless and isolated. Your weapon was forged in hatred," Elswyth replied, her voice gaining the harmonics of Sidhe power, awakened to its full potential. "But our bond was forged in willing sacrifice. One consumes, the other creates. Guess which proves stronger in the end?" The consecrated blade shattered in Lucien's grip, its blessing unable to maintain coherence when faced with devotion that surpassed its capacity to corrupt. But Benedict only smiled, revealing teeth that belonged to no earthly creature. "Then I will simply have to kill you both with my own hands." The Heartstone blazed to life between them like a newborn star, materializing from the convergence of Sidhe power and guardian devotion that no devourer had ever witnessed before. It was not large, no bigger than Elswyth's closed fist, but its crystalline surface contained depths that seemed to hold entire galaxies of possibility. Benedict recoiled from the stone's radiance as if it were acid against his borrowed flesh. "What have you done?" he snarled, his carefully maintained human disguise beginning to dissolve entirely under the pressure of powers that predated his kind by eons. "What we were meant to do," Elswyth replied, her voice now carrying harmonics that made the ancient symbols carved throughout the chamber pulse with answering light. "What our ancestors prepared us for across generations of sacrifice and patience." The Heartstone rose from her palm, floating between her and Lucien as it drew energy from both of their transformed natures. Where it passed, the cracks in the Master Ward stone began to heal, stone flowing like water to repair damage that had seemed irreversible moments before. But more than simple restoration was taking place. The old ward network had been built for a world where supernatural beings hid in shadows and worked through careful intermediaries. The new protections, emerging from the Heartstone's influence, were designed for a reality where the boundaries between worlds had grown thin enough that ancient truths could no longer be denied. Benedict lunged toward the floating crystal with claws that had burst through his fingertips like black thorns. But Lucien intercepted him, and their collision sent shockwaves through the chamber that made the very foundations of the earth tremble. This was no longer vampire fighting false priest, this was guardian, confronting destroyer, in a battle that echoed conflicts as old as consciousness itself. "Your kind are parasites," Lucien said as they grappled, his transformed strength now matching the devourer's supernatural fury. "You contribute nothing, create nothing, preserve nothing. You exist only to consume what others have built through love and sacrifice." "And your kind are fools," Benedict replied, his true form now fully revealed as something that hurt to look at directly. Hunger, given shape, emptiness, refined into malevolent purpose. Binding yourselves to mortals who fear and reject you, sacrificing your own nature for creatures who would destroy you without hesitation if they knew what you truly were. Around them, the possessed villagers continued their chanting, but the words were beginning to change. As the Heartstone's influence spread through the chamber, the spiritual poison that had clouded their minds was being burned away. One by one, they began to remember who they were and what they owed to the woman they had driven into exile. Margaret Thorne was the first to break free, her voice cracking as she tried to speak words of her own choosing. "Elswyth," she managed, tears streaming down her hollowed cheeks. "What have we done? What has that thing made us do?" Old Henrik followed, his weathered hands reaching toward the growing light as if seeking forgiveness. "Child, we failed you. We let fear make us cruel when we should have protected you as you protected us. But their awakening came with a cost. As each villager broke free from Benedict's control, the Devourer's true power began to manifest more directly. Shadows erupted from his form like living things, reaching toward the Heartstone with intent to corrupt its pure radiance. "If I cannot feast on your power through willing sacrifice," Benedict roared, his voice now a harmony of hunger and rage that made the chamber walls crack, "then I will simply tear it from your corpses and feed on the spiritual devastation that follows." The shadows struck like serpents, wrapping around the Heartstone and beginning to drain its light, but they had not accounted for the nature of what they were trying to consume. The stone's power came not from any single source, but from the willing bond between healer and guardian, Sidhe and protector, love and duty united in common cause. Elswyth felt the drain beginning and stepped closer to Lucien, their joined hands creating a circuit that the Heartstone used to draw even more power from their combined natures. The light, blazing from the crystal, intensified until it hurt to look at directly, but it was a clean pain, like staring into the sun rather than into darkness. "Together," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of Benedict's fury and the villagers' confused prayers. "Always," Lucien replied, his guardian nature finally understanding the true meaning of the ancient oaths his bloodline had sworn. The Heartstone pulsed once more, drawing every shadow in the chamber into itself before exploding outward in a wave of purifying light that washed over everything it touched. Benedict's scream cut through dimensions as the radiance struck him, his stolen form beginning to dissolve under exposure to power that represented everything his kind sought to destroy. But even as he fell, the Devourer managed one final act of malice. The collapsing ward network had been holding back more than just spiritual predators. It had been containing things that even creatures like Benedict feared to face directly. "If I cannot have this feast," he whispered, as his form began to dissolve into component shadows, "then I will ensure no one else survives to rebuild what you think you have saved." The chamber shook as something vast stirred in the spaces between worlds. Drawn by the scent of failing protections and the promise of a realm left defenseless by the destruction of its guardians. Elswyth felt its attention turning toward them like a physical weight, and she realized that defeating Benedict had been only the beginning of their real test. The new covenant scroll materialized in the chamber's suddenly peaceful air, its parchment gleaming with words that wrote themselves in scripts both ancient and startlingly modern. Where Benedict's malevolent presence had poisoned the very atmosphere moments before, now there was only the clean scent of rain after storm and the gentle hum of power being used for its intended purpose. Elswyth watched the scroll unfold, its contents establishing new laws for coexistence between the supernatural and mortal communities. Gone were the old restrictions that had forced beings like her ancestors to hide their true nature. In their place stood principles based on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the understanding that both worlds were stronger when they worked together rather than in fearful separation. "It's beautiful," Margaret Thorne whispered, her voice still weak from months of spiritual drain, but growing stronger with each passing moment. "I can read it, we can all read it, no matter what language it's written in." "How is that possible?" "Because understanding is a choice," Elswyth replied gently, her transformed nature allowing her to speak truths that bridged the gap between mortal comprehension and supernatural reality. "The scroll isn't changing the words, it's opening your willingness to see past the barriers that fear created." Around them, the other villagers who had been freed from Benedict's influence were experiencing similar revelations. The terror that had driven them to exile their most gifted healer was dissolving, replaced by shame, wonder, and a growing determination to make amends for wrongs committed under malevolent influence. Old Henrik stepped forward, his weathered hands shaking as he reached toward Elswyth. "Child, can you forgive us? Can you forgive what we allowed ourselves to become?" The question carried the weight of months of anguish, but looking at their hollow faces and seeing the genuine remorse in their eyes, Elswyth found that forgiveness came more easily than she'd expected. The anger that had sustained her through exile was being transformed by her awakened nature into something more constructive compassion that could heal wounds in souls as well as bodies. "There's nothing to forgive that wasn't orchestrated by our true enemy," she said, extending her hands toward Henrik and the others. "Benedict fed on fear and isolation, turned your natural caution into weapons against the very person you needed to protect you. Understanding that makes forgiveness not just possible, but necessary." The warmth that flowed from her touch was different from her earlier healing abilities. Where before she had worked with herbs and careful manipulation of natural energies, now she could directly address the spiritual damage that prolonged exposure to a devourer had inflicted. One by one, the villagers felt their vitality returning, their natural resilience restored by contact with power that sought only to nurture and strengthen. Lucien stood slightly apart, his guardian nature allowing him to monitor the broader supernatural environment while Elswyth worked with the immediate community. The great stirring that Benedict's death had triggered was settling back into dormancy, the entity beyond the veil, recognizing that this realm was once again properly defended. "The new ward network is stabilizing," he reported, his enhanced senses reading the flow of protective energy as it spread out from the Heartstone to encompass not just Millhaven, but dozens of surrounding communities. "But it's different from what came before, stronger but also more permeable. Because it's not built on hiding anymore," Elswyth explained, helping young Peter to his feet as color returned to his previously ashen cheeks. "The old protections were designed to keep supernatural influences separate from mortal life. The new ones are meant to filter and regulate contact between the worlds, allowing beneficial interactions while blocking those that would cause harm. It was a more complex system, requiring active participation from both supernatural and mortal communities, rather than passive acceptance of boundaries they didn't understand. But it was also more robust, less vulnerable to the kind of systematic corruption that had nearly destroyed everything their ancestors had built. Margaret Thorne looked around the chamber with new eyes, seeing the carved symbols and accumulated wisdom not as evidence of dangerous heresy, but as testament to generations of sacrifice made on behalf of people like herself. "What happens now?" she asked. "Do you return to the village? Do things go back to the way they were?" Elswyth exchanged a glance with Lucien, and in that moment of connection she felt the full scope of what they had become. The awakening that had saved their community had also transformed them into something that could never quite belong to any single place or people. They were bridges now, bound to serve the larger harmony between worlds, rather than the interests of any particular group. "Things can never go back to exactly the way they were," she said gently. "Too much has changed, too much has been revealed. But that doesn't mean we're abandoning you. It means we're taking responsibility for something bigger than any of us individually." The New Covenant scroll continued to write itself, establishing protocols for communication between communities, guidelines for identifying and dealing with future supernatural threats, and frameworks for education that would prevent the kind of ignorance-based fear that had made Benedict's manipulation possible. Other scrolls were materializing now, appearing in locations throughout the region where similar awakenings were taking place. The defeat of the Devourer had sent ripples through the supernatural community, alerting those with old blood that the time of hiding was ending and the time of conscious cooperation was beginning. "Will we see you again?" Henrik asked, though his tone suggested he already understood the answer. "When you need us," Lucien replied, his guardian oath extending now to protection that went far beyond any single village or bloodline. "When the balance requires adjustment, when threats arise that mortal strength alone cannot address, we'll be there." As they prepared to leave the chamber that had witnessed their transformation, Elswyth felt a profound sense of completion. The loneliness that had driven her to free a chained stranger in the darkness was gone, replaced by connection to purposes and partnerships that would span lifetimes. She had lost her place in the ordinary world, But she had gained something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge of who she truly was and what she was meant to accomplish. The ruined chapel above them was already beginning to change, stone walls straightening and roof beams rebuilding themselves as the restored ward network encouraged growth and healing in everything it touched. But the greatest restoration had taken place in the depths, where two lost souls had discovered they were meant to be found.